Debbie Griffith will show you this afternoon, you'll be able to realize, hey, some of those things out there are more than just rocks. They really do mean something. And actually what Greg showed you to begin with is very, very important. In fact, we have a 2-day workshop just on tool making for the Texas Archaeological Society. So tools from that nodule are just extremely important. And one of the things around here is that they didn't have nodules like that, except when they came down the river. So the flint or chert was very rare in this area. So let's get started. I'd love for you to have questions. I hope you will put them in on chat. I wouldn't even mind being interrupted, but Greg set the pattern for you to put them in chat, so that's great. So let's see. Bill, I'm not getting an advance here.
Put your cursor on the screen. Yeah, try it.
Nope.
So you got to get rid of that panel there.
Okay, I'm not getting
Click on the blue screen.
an advance yet. Here we go. Okay, here's the timeline for the coastal archaeology. And when we are doing archaeology, we always, of course, begin at ground surface. And so when you look at this timeline, I start with the most recent, or 1900. Of course, that's pretty old at this point. But our historic time period, when you think about it, begins when we get writing. Okay, that's the criteria for the historic time period all over the world. So it's at different times. The historic time period in Egypt would be a lot earlier, obviously. But our historic time period begins here in 1500, when we have the Spanish and a little bit later the French coming into this area. If we started doing an excavation in this particular area, if we had all of these eras represented, our next earlier culture would be the late prehistoric, which you see here, operating in this area from about 1000 to 1500s. Before that, we have the archaic, which is a term that you probably know related to other things, but for us, for the Native Americans who lived in this area, that is a very long time period. If you look at this, it's 1000 to 5000 BC. That means 6,000 years the people lived in this particular mode of archaic. And as we go through the slides today, you'll begin to get the feeling for what that means. These terms will become a little bit more familiar. The very earliest time period that we have represented here is the Paleo Indian, which would be 10,000 BC. When you talk in BC, you have to add our 2,000 years where we are currently. So that's 12,000 years ago. It's really a very long time frame, and yet we have that time period represented here in the coastal bend. The sites that I'm going to talk about today are sites that I have a personal relationship with. I've been actually working in the field since the 1970s, and mainly at that time I lived in Houston, and so I was working along the coast in Galveston. So that's one of the sites that I'll talk about. But today I'm going to show you sites that are near here. The first one that I'll talk about is Nueces County. And again, I worked with the university out of Kingsville, A&M University out of Kingsville, on a survey in that area. The next site that I'll talk about is one that's actually on San Antonio Bay. And when you look at this, you see 41 CL2, okay, 41 stands for Texas, and CL stands for the county, and 2 is the second site recorded in that county. The next three sites, well, actually 4, are all historic period sites. First of all, the Bell, which of course was the Lasalle ship that sank in Matagorda Bay. And again, I worked on that because I was part of the team from the Texas Historic Commission. The next site is the French site, Fort St. Louis. Okay, and that site was one that a lot of the people in Victoria worked on, the people that you will hear about this afternoon. And then the Spanish site, Presidio La Bahia #1. If you're familiar with La Bahia, which is in Goliad today, that's about the 4th location for this mission. The Spanish had an interesting way of moving their missions around to try to have the most successful ones. And the last piece that I'll talk about briefly is underwater exploration. And again, I had a chance to be part of the project called the Monterey Shipwreck. When we look at Nueces County, this was survey that was led by Dr. Bob Droulet out of the Kingsville campus. And I'm showing you several different ways that archaeology gets done. It's hard for people to realize, but we've got the universities who do research-based archaeology, and that's what this project was. Another way that archaeology gets done is in response to the Environmental Protection Act. So archaeology is a part of all of the projects that go forward with governmental money. So the second project that I'll show you was done with government money. We call it Cultural Resource Management, or CRM. And that's a very interesting piece too. So for this investigation in Nueces County, Dr. Droulet set up a pattern of survey all along the river, the Nueces River. And so his goal was to try to determine what sites were in that area and see how the Native Americans were living in that particular area. And they surveyed. When they found a concentration of artifacts, then they did an excavation. And they were camped out for 4 weeks or 6 weeks, depending on the length of the session. And at night, they did their lab work. So they found a lot of evidence of that early or that late Archaic time period and the late Prehistoric time period. They also found that there were primary campsites and satellite campsites. They have imagined that the secondary campsites were where they set up hunting camps, and the larger campsites would be living sites. So this is a very interesting thing that they were able to do. First of all, they had to do survey, and this is just as you imagine looking for a lost child. So you're looking for lost artifacts out here in this field, and they were essentially spaced about 10 feet apart and all walking in a line. The river is behind those trees over there, as you often see when you're out looking to determine, where a river might be. Rivers, of course, were very important. It was a source of water. So when you think about looking for where did the early people settle, think about where you would set up your campsite. So you'd want to be on high ground. You'd want access to water. You'd want to be near an area where you could also get food. And that might be that the animals were coming to the river. So you would set up your campsite just like they would set up their campsite just like we would today. Oops. Next, when they found an artifact, they recorded it. You see somebody is working with a clipboard, and as technology came in during the time they were working on this, they would bring their GPS into it. But here you see the flags tagging all of the artifacts that were in that immediate area. Then excavation units would be set up so that they could actually check out what was under the ground, because if they had items, artifacts on the surface, they were pretty sure that they would find something under the ground. Actually, they would have done a small test pit first, the size of a shovel, and then do this excavation. Here you see the excavation units. which are squared up and measured. At this particular juncture, they are recording the wall in this excavation unit. So the wall would show you layers. It would show you layers of soil. Okay, Greg, so you've got your geology right here, layers of soil, and then any artifacts that might be in there. This might be one of the kind of artifacts that they would find. And this would be probably from the late prehistoric period. It might be used as a tool for something like a knife, or another piece that would be like a hoe. So what I'm trying to show you is that not all Indian artifacts are points or arrowheads, but there are many different tools that they used in their daily life. Here we have two of the students working in a grid. Everything for the excavation, of course, is put into a defined grid so that when an artifact or a feature you might find a fire pit would be recorded exactly where it is. And they would then create a map, make photographs, and show exactly where it was. Because the thing that's most important in archaeology is the association of the artifacts, not the single artifacts, but the association. What do they tell us? In some areas, you might have a butchering site, so you would have bones along with tools. Another area, you might have that campfire ring. Another area, you might have clay and residue from making pottery. So you want to be able to define these living and activity areas. And here we have an example of a bone bed. It's only a small part of it, and they'll excavate on into the wall. But you have, again, a, well, I hope you can see it, but it's a very pale board that shows you the designations for where it is. I believe it's called feature 3E2, and it's got a specific number. So all that goes back in the computer at the end of the day. But what you're looking at is a bone bed with probably deer. Okay. Every bucket of soil that is removed from that excavation is then put through a screen to be able to recover any small artifacts that might have been missed in the excavation itself. So here you see one of the students doing the screening for that particular unit. All the soil from one unit is kept segregated from the other soil so that you know exactly where an artifact was found. Here are some of the artifacts that have come out of that particular area. Okay, so, and we're not going to try to get into this today, but these points or arrowheads, as you might know them, these points all have names based on the place that they were first found. And then they would be dated if there is organic material around them. The point, the arrowhead itself can't be dated just on the stone, but it has to be in association with something that can be dated. So organic material, wood or bone can be dated, and then your associated artifact would be given that age as well. If you look on the far right upper level, you're looking at a tool, something like I showed you to begin with, and these we think were gouges. Okay, they get the name clear fork gouge, but again, these are a lot of different tools. Tools get sharpened and become smaller as you sharpen the edges of them. And sometimes they start out as a large knife, and they might end up as a small arrowhead. Here are the students in the evenings, and I think Debbie will show you a little bit more about actually what goes on in a lab scenario. but the artifacts are classified by material. Again, the counts are put into the computer that you see there, and then they're bagged according to the unit, according to the square that they came out of. So that, again, the object is really creating the associations, understanding what was there and what you can get out of it altogether. This site that they were working on is portrayed as an interpretive piece here. And this group is actually called the Coahuiltecans, who lived a little bit further south here. But what we see, and the reason I'm bringing this up, we see that the Karankawa Indians, who are familiar to a lot of people, lived along the rivers during this summer and spring, and then in the fall and the winter, they came to the coast. And this is an established pattern. It's documented by actually measuring the growth of some of the shells that we'll find on the coast, and they can determine the exact month and the age, say, of the mollusk, of the oyster, or the clam that we'll see in a minute. And we know we have the early records of those first Spanish who came and observed the Native Americans, and we know that they moved between these riverine environments where they were hunting and gathering. Here we have a mesquite bush. They actually reported them eating the mesquite beans. Okay, so there are a lot of resources out there that we might not think of today. In this picture in the foreground, you see prickly pear cactus leaves. And then, of course, they're using the reeds that they found, like cattails, to create baskets. You see the skins from deer, and it looks like the fellow standing by the tree has a rabbit. So they really had a lot of resources, and they were able to live fairly well, actually, with the resources that they could gather from the local environment. Okay, again, that group of people that we just saw were probably late prehistoric. Okay, so that was the time period in which they lived. Next, we're going to look at a Guadalupe Bay site. Okay, and this is Calhoun County. Remember, I told you the site would have a number based on the state of Texas is 41. So this system was established by the Smithsonian. If you ever see artifacts or see anything that has an official designation on it, we'll usually have this 3-part number. So 41 for Texas, CL for Calhoun County, and number 2 for the second site recorded there. When you record a site, you send all of the information to Austin, and they assign you a number. So this number 2 was assigned by the state of Texas, and that's the way they're set up. This particular site will have late archaic to historic time periods. So that's a pretty good swath of time in there. Thousands of years. You see the numbers of years here from 600 BC to 1800 AD. So this must have been a really, really good place to live. And they stayed there because they could use the resources that were in the environment that you see here. It's actually called the Guadalupe Bay Site, even though there's not a Guadalupe Bay here, it just got named that. But here it is on San Antonio Bay. And it's part of a project that was mandated by an EPA, an environmental protection survey. This canal that goes up to Victoria, okay, the Victoria Barge Canal, was going to be expanded. And so when this happened, they had to do a survey. They found artifacts along the shore, and they were required to excavate that area, all of the area that would be removed essentially as they enlarged that canal. So this is the way a lot of projects happen. Here we have, you see the river in the background, the Guadalupe River. And here you have again an excavation going on. It gives you the sense of how excavations are set up to define the areas that you're working in. This is a checkerboard pattern. You can see that the excavators are set up in units so that they don't actually just so they don't bump into each other. So they have plenty of room to work and define this particular area that they're working in. Again, I hope you can see this, look at this excavation. What you see in the top part of the slide is essentially an entire floor of shell that are oyster and mussel combined, because we have mussels along the river bottoms. Okay, and then what you see in the foreground is the wall of this excavation. So you see, as they begin to excavate, they were not finding artifacts, very many artifacts, and then they come upon a whole layer of this shell concentration. And this is really a garbage pit. It's what's been left over after they ate the oyster shell, the oysters and the clam shells. It's not a natural formation, but it's something that's been done by people. And so it's one of those areas we call a midden, and that's just a word that you may have encountered before if you've read much in archaeology. A midden is the trash pit or garbage pit. And archaeologists spend a lot of time working in those, even historic garbage pits, okay? I think one of the most interesting ones actually happened in the 1990s when in Arizona, they thought they were not getting a true census, that people were not reporting everybody who was living in an apartment. And so they sent the archaeologist in to analyze garbage, okay, analyze people's garbage. And what they were able to pretty well prove was that, yes, there were more people in an apartment than were being reported to the census. And they did that by analyzing the garbage. So that was the modern garbage done by archaeologists in Arizona. Here we have the drawings of some of the points that came out of this area again. You see a lot of different pieces. Here's your scale. And so you can see some of them are really large. Some of them were used on the dart and atlatls, which I'll show you later on in this morning. They were not, these are mainly dart points, not arrowheads, okay? Oh, but looky here, they were also using bone. Okay, remember I said they didn't have much in the way of stone. So stone was really valuable and rare in this area. So they had to be inventive. And what you see on the top row here are points that they would have used either on a dart or on an arrow. But they are deer bone that have been shaped so that they're pointed and can actually kill something. So then what you see down on the bottom two rows are ornaments. So these are, again, bone that have been, holes have been drilled in them. And these would be strung on a necklace, okay, or even possibly sewn on deer hide garment, something like that. Sometimes we find burials that actually have the garment, the deer skin has decayed, but we find the remnants of this either shells or bones in a pattern, and we can really determine, you know, that these were sewn on some kind of a vest. And here we have, of course, a lot of shells. You saw the location of this site, so you know that they could just go down to the coast, wade along the beach, and get different shells. These were probably used for ornament. You see the olive shell on the left could have been strung again as an ornament. The shells on the far right, however, seem to have been worked, seem to have been modified to be used as a scraper. So they were using everything in many different ways. This site along the coast has one phase of it that's actually known as the Rockport Phase. And this is the Rockport Pottery. And what you see here are vessels. Looking at the bottom set of vessels, these vessels are anywhere from 12 to 18 inches high. These were large pots. They do have rounded bottoms so that and the sand would be dug out underneath them so that you could settle your pot that way. The black that you see is actually asphaltum. Sometimes growing up along the beach, everybody always said, oh, all that black gooey tar, oh, it came from ships. Oh, it's just terrible. Oh, how awful. Well, asphaltum is actually a natural that exudes from the sand and can be gathered. And so this is what the people used for decoration. You see the black decorations on the top pottery. You see the whole pots that are essentially painted in this asphaltum. But this was an early way of using this particular substance for decoration on what's called Rockport pottery. This has a defined time period in the late prehistoric time period. So when this type of pottery is found, then the site is given that date. So again, we're doing relative dating. If we find something associated with this kind of pottery, then we give it that date. This is an elaborate chart, but this was part of the report that they did on this Guadalupe Bay site. And again, if you look at the bottom of your chart, you've got 600 BC, or all the way over on the right, you've got 1000 BC. And you have the defined time period, this late archaic time period in gray on the right, your prehistoric period, and then finally the historic period in sort of an orange. And then the areas again are defined by the type of pottery. So when you look in the middle of this chart, okay, this is defining exactly what pottery was found at what times. This is a typical chart that charts many different things, but this is a chart about the pottery specifically that was found at that site. So this is the kind of detail that's recorded for a project like this, so that we can actually come up with a time frame for when those people were living at that particular site. Well, here we have an artist's interpretation of this Guadalupe Bay site, and it has a lot of what you might imagine. Looking from the left, you've got hunters coming back with a deer, because we know there were deer along the coast. The people sitting in the middle here are probably possibly shelling oysters. The two men that are in kind of the center of the picture have large bows, and this is the way bows were recorded, essentially as tall as the people. Somebody's creating the net. We think that they had nets for catching fish, and at the bottom of these nets you'll see weights. Okay, so we sometimes find shell with those holes in them, like I showed you a minute ago, that we think were tied on the bottom of nets to weight them down. Looks like fish drying, wiki up shelter that you see over here with some pottery. Some people are in the bay gathering shells. Some are out in canoes, actually probably fishing. These people that we call Karankawa lived on the areas of the bay. They did not live on the Gulf side. They didn't live on the beach side of the islands. They lived on the bay side, where they could actually utilize a lot more of the environment, be able to gather a lot more resources. Okay, again, let's move on to the historic, which would be after 1500. You probably remember the bell. I hope you do remember the bell that was discovered in 1995. This ship sank in 1686. Imagine that. They were definitely here. The French were here. Of course, the Spanish were here before them, but it sank in 1686 during a storm. Lasalle had come into Matagorda Bay and created a small settlement, not anything you could call a colony, but a small settlement up Garcitas Creek. And the Belle was the last of 4 ships that he had come from France in. And this ship, the Belle, was essentially anchored in Matagorda Bay. A storm came up. The sailors lost control of it, and it was pushed onto Matagorda Peninsula, where it just sort of floundered in the mud there. And that was how it sank. So it sank gradually. And when it did, it was covered up with sand and mud. And the environment is what we call anaerobic. So it did not have oxygen, which causes the decay. So it was protected as it settled into this mud and sand. And it remained there for a little over 300 years, really, truly amazing. Since the French had come into what was Spanish territory, the Spanish were looking for them all along. They had already heard, actually from Indian resources, that the Spanish had heard that the French were challenging their territory here in what is now Texas. So they began looking for them. They actually made a map of the location. So people have known for years that this ship was out there in Matagorda Bay, but it was never really located until 1995. At that time, the Texas Historic Commission chartered a survey of the area with a magnetometer, and that's a metal detector that floats and records what's under the water. So they could only do that when they got the funding to have this magnetometer survey. They began a survey of Matagorda Bay and identified many different spots where there was metal under the water or on the sand underneath. As you can imagine, a lot of trash gets dumped, and they would have had a lot of different areas to look at. The bay itself, Matagorda Bay, is so muddy and that you really can't see. It's not like the Caribbean or someplace where you see pictures of beautiful water and lovely artifacts just sitting on the beach. But so they had to dive. So they began essentially diving. And as it were, on the first dive, the fellow with the red kerchief on actually put his hands on this cannon. And his name is Chuck Mead. He was experienced enough to know that he'd really hit something. He ran his hand all along the cannon itself. That little ball on the left that you're looking at here is called the cassabel. Put his hand on that, and then he ran his hand all the way down until he came to the bore, or the open end of it. And he was so excited. I mean, this was just an amazing feat to have found that on the first dive. So they got a crane and got help from people around the Palacios area. And this is how they pulled it up. This is what it looked like when they pulled it up. They're all talking about it, what it might mean. They didn't know at that point, was it a Confederate cannon? Was it a French cannon? Was it a Spanish cannon? They really didn't know till they began to really look at it and investigate it and then clean it up. And when they did clean it up, this is what it looked like. And we're not looking at the top of it, but you've probably seen this before. But of course, it's got the, starting on the left end, you've got the fleur-de-lis. And then about 2/3 of the way down, you have a crest, which is for the Count La Vermandois. and he was the illegitimate son of Louis XIV, and he was admiral of the French fleet. Okay, so here's his crest on this, and then the dolphin handle. So this is definitely a French vessel, which certainly meant everybody was pretty excited. Because it was such an important site, a very unique site, and because the waters of Matagorda Bay are so murky, that we built a coffer dam around the ship itself. So you're looking at the island that was out there in Matagorda Bay for almost a year. And you got two rims of steel. Steel was sunk into the sand. The water here is only 12 feet deep, okay, only 12 feet deep. They wanted to be able to really do a true excavation. Let me show you a diagram that shows you how things were set up. So you have your outer wall, which are steel sheets that were driven into the ground, and the inner wall, and then it was filled in around that wall to create this island. And then the water was pumped out of the middle where the bell was defined, and then the excavation began. So this is the way everything was set up. Now, Lasalle is an interesting character. He had been in Canada. He came down the Mississippi River and claimed all of the territory drained by the Mississippi River for King Louis. He went back to France, talked the king into partially supporting his next expedition. He had some businessmen involved in it too, and he sailed with 4 ships. They came to the islands, first of all, and got new supplies, and then they came across the Gulf of Mexico. They probably went right by the Mississippi River, but it's very hard to identify at that point. And so they continued their voyage on down the coastline until they finally really had to dock somewhere. And so this is when they went into Matagorda Bay, thinking that there might be a large river that would actually be the Mississippi. This is a representation of the bell during the storm. You see the stores in the ship itself. And if you look at the cutaway here, you'll see the different cargo that's in there, and we'll see that in a minute in the excavation. Here's the excavation once the ship had truly been outlined. And as you look at this particular view, if you start on the left, as we frequently do, this is the stern. And you can see again those divisions that you saw when you looked at the cargo of the ship itself. And this is the way that we found it. So you have the stern section, and then you have a sort of midsection. This section was a little jumbled. We think that the sailors, while they were on the ship, probably lived in that particular area. Then you see an area with barrels and crates. That was the main cargo area. And then finally at the bow, you see rope. Okay, that's rope in there. When you look at this is the inside of the cofferdam, of course, and you can see just to the side of the stairways, you can see just how deep the water might have been, sort of like a bathtub ring. So it's only 12 feet deep. But by pumping the water out, this excavation could be conducted in a very detailed way, and it went on for 9 months, 7 days a week. Again, this is a representation of what was found on the bell once it was largely excavated. Beginning at the top part of this drawing, you see the rope. And in this rope were bones and a skull. This is the one skeleton that was found. We don't know why or how, but it appeared somebody just crawled into the space and died. And then we have the main cargo area where you see the crates. There were guns, there were barrels of things to trade. There were cooking utensils, just a little bit of everything in this midsection. And then this fore section, which, the stern section, which was a bit jumbled, but which also has some very interesting artifacts that I'll show you. Here's the one skeleton, the skull, and a representation of the sailor who was probably in his mid-30s. Excuse me, let me go. Can I go back?
Yeah.
Previous, let's see.
There.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite artifacts. These are actually the archaeologist drawings. These were bells. Okay, these were hawk bells actually, and it's really a fascinating use of these. They're brass and they have different designations on them. But these hawk bells in Europe were used on falcons, just like when you see the falcon show at the Hummingbird Festival or something. You put bells on your hawk or your falcon and send him off to hunt. And you can keep track of where your hawk is going by the sound of the bell, so you know what your bell sounds like as it's traveling. But here in the New World, okay, in North America, they were used for trade. The Native Americans really valued these bells, so we have quite a few of the hawk bells. Here's another drawing from the excavation itself, which are fascinating to me. Again, you see at the top of this photograph a lot of the musket balls, very small musket balls, okay? And then in the sort of center section, you see something that looks like pottery or pots. And these are, oops, sorry. These are actually fire pots, okay? And what they were sort of a grenade, a large grenade. They were filled with gunpowder. A wick was put in. The wick came through a wooden lid, and then it could be lighted and thrown onto another ship. So these were weapons in case the French were attacked by Spanish. While one of the ships, Lasalle actually did lose one of his ships, one of his French ships to the Spanish. So we had that going on. We have sort of a Pirates of the Caribbean happening all this time in this time period, if you can imagine that. Okay, so the Spanish knew that the French were here. So they did a lot of searches. They were looking for this settlement, which we today call Fort St. Louis. Probably they didn't call it that at the time. But the Spanish sent out 11 expeditions to try to find Lasalle. They sent some by water and some by land. And they came upon it. They came upon the fort after the people had been massacred by the Guadalupe Indians. And they find several of the people still in clothing, not decayed, and they buried them. Later, these were found by the Historic Commission. So then Fort St. Louis has been something that people have looked for years. During the excavation of the bell, a ranch manager from a nearby ranch came to the Historic Commission and said, you know, I think I've located something that you're going to want to see. And he took them out to show them. This is a map created by the Spanish who arrived at the site after the massacre. So the Spanish actually show the number of buildings that were there and the number of cannons. So when you look at this, you see 8 cannons identified. The Spanish then buried those cannons all in one pit because they didn't want the French to be able to come back and set up a fort again. This is what the Texas Historic Commission found when they followed up with the ranch manager. So here you have the French cannons buried by the Spanish and excavated by the Texas Historic Commission. this is during the time that the bell was still being excavated. So the commission had to raise funds to do a second excavation. So it was several years before they got back around to it, actually doing the excavation. These are the iron cannon that you can see actually in the Museum of the Coastal Bend, and we'll see those in the tour this afternoon, I'm sure. This is a artist rendering of what the French fort probably looked like. On your left, you have Garcitas Creek, and then you have those buildings that were represented on that map and the cannon that you see placed around on this. This was a defensive position. This is a bluff along Garcitas Creek so that the French were protected. The Spanish sailed right by them when they were doing their search and never saw them up here. But now the French have died and the Spanish have taken control of the area, and they build the Presidio La Bahia right at the same location. This is a drawing of what the Spanish were going to construct. This is their La Bahia, okay? When the Historic Commission started excavating the site, of course, the first thing they came upon were the Spanish artifacts. So here you see those, because see, the Spanish built on top of the French fort. These are all artifacts from that Spanish fort or Presidio. These are a symbol that they had to ward off evil that the Spanish had. So this first location of Presidio La Bahia was right there on Garcitas Creek. Their second location was on the Guadalupe River in Victoria. And there is a marker for that in the city park on the Guadalupe River. The third location is Mission Valley. And again, we have an archaeological number for it, 41 VT11. And then finally, this mission was moved to Goliad on the San Antonio River. So this is its fourth location for sure. The reason that the missionaries moved was largely the Garcitas Creek was not a very good site. There were terrible mosquitoes, alligators that came on shore and whatnot. So the missionaries were trying to find the best site, okay, to set up their operation. So here we have again a representation of what was excavated by the Historic Commission, that they could reconstruct this. You see the French settlements in blue, and then the Spanish Presidio on top of that. So they didn't quite achieve what they had set out to with their drawing, but they did actually have this configuration out there on Garcitas Creek. Okay, just a few minutes on the underwater explorations. I was invited in the early 2000s to be a part of this project, which was out in the Gulf of Mexico. And it was underwater, nobody could dive. It was too deep for anybody to dive. So what they were doing was sending down robots to actually locate what was down here. This particular site of a shipwreck was found when they were doing an underwater survey to lay a pipe out to some oil rigs, okay? So again, this was a project that was dictated by the Environmental Protection Agency. And you can see some timbers in this first picture. The pink is obviously some sea animal that I can't identify, but what you see is the shipwreck itself. It was pretty well mapped before this major project got underway. So you can see the outline of the ship. You see the anchor on the left-hand side of this drawing. You see an anchor on the deck. And then the red or pink color that you see there is metal, and that was probably some kind of a stove. and other things that you see scattered on the deck. You see, I believe, an anchor toward the right-hand side out there. So what happened was the NOAA got the monies together and partnered with the Texas Historic Commission to go in. They rented a ship from the explorer who had found the Titanic. Okay, so they had that ship for a week, and they sent robots down to film and pick up artifacts. So you have 2 robots that are working on this shipwreck underwater. One, as you see here with the lights, and the other one that we don't see is taking the picture. So this is thousands of feet down in the Gulf of Mexico. So this is the way they begin to explore for something like that. They picked up about 60 or 70 artifacts so that they could identify the time period for this. And it was in the early 1800s. And they were hoping, actually, against all hope, that it would be a ship from the Texas Navy. That would be a really exciting find for everybody. So they were hoping that maybe it would be the San Antonio of the Texas Navy, because the San Antonio actually left New Orleans after getting resupplied on a trip to the Yucatan and never made it. And a storm came up shortly after it left New Orleans. So they were hoping that it might be the San Antonio, but it did not prove to be that. It did not have the right artifacts on it. When they were working on this shipwreck, they also explored near the shipwreck and found 2 more ships. One of those ships had hides on it. So they speculate that this was a group of 3 that did get destroyed in a storm, and that they were essentially escorting each other, because this early period in the 1830s, 40s was a time period when there was still a lot of raiding going on in the Gulf of Mexico. You still had the Spanish and the British, as well as the Mexicans, sailing in the Gulf of Mexico during this time when we had the Republic of Texas. So it was, in the end, it was undefined. They're still hoping to get the funding to go back and look at this particular site and the nearby sites again. So the story continues. As you can see, these projects were fairly recent, but the story continues. You can see many of the objects from the bell at the Maritime Museum in Rockport, and also at the Museum of the Coastal Bend, which we'll see later in a tour that Greg will give us. There is something called the Lasalle Trail, and there are 7 sites along the Gulf Coast that will tell you different pieces of the story of Lasalle. So that's really an interesting thing to do. The Maritime has those maps. We did an exhibit at the History Center on the archaeology of Aransas County, actually. And so that was a couple of years ago, and we continue to bring that up as different topics as we look at it. Okay, that's our slideshow for today. And I'd love to take questions.
So everyone can unmute yourself at this time. I don't think I can. And we have just a few things in our chat session. Rachel Shaney, interjected a point that, and I'm sure a lot of people that have tilled the land have found artifacts related to, tilling that land. And she says that they have some of those artifacts still in their possession. It's from Central Texas, and they are still own that land. And how can she find out more about that? And Debbie interjected that, well, you can bring it to Cobalt. You can actually be there while they look at those artifacts and tell you more about them.
That would be a great thing. Am I unmuted too?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, yes, you could certainly take them to the Museum of the Coastal Bend. And we also have, we're going to have an excavation field school for the Texas Archeological Society this summer near Kerrville. So that might be something, if you're really truly interested in it, you can spend anywhere from, 1 to 10 days in an excavation setting right there in Central Texas. Okay, what else? Does anybody?
And Paul had asked about the use of asphaltum, whether in addition to waterproofing vessels or pots and baskets, whether they use the asphaltum to waterproof their canoes.
Most of what I've read about canoes is that they were hollowed out logs. Okay, so we're not thinking of a canoe like a birch bark canoe, but it was a hollowed out log. They burned and scraped the wood until they got a canoe shape. Okay, so I don't think that they would have used asphaltum, but the Maritime Museum is putting together an exhibit on the Karankawa, and they're borrowing a canoe from the Corpus Christi Museum. So we'd be able to really look at that and see what they've got.
Okay, any other questions?
I think there was some more.
There was something else on chat. Let's see.
Jason had
Can't get chat.
provided some information that LaBelle was about 54 feet long. It didn't look that big. I was surprised when the image inside the cofferdam next to people, it didn't really look that. I was surprised how small it looked, but 54 feet is still pretty good size.
Yeah, it was 64 by about 14 or 16. And it's very interesting. When we were trying to teach school children about it, we would lay out a rope in the shape of the bell and have them get into it to see what little area there was for people to live. Again, today, if you go to the Museum of the Coastal Bend in Victoria, yes, we're promoting that. Anyway, if you go there as you enter the museum, in the walkway, they have an outline of the bell so you can get a sense of how big it is. And yeah, it was a surprise. I mean, shrimp boats or large yachts are bigger than that today. Incidentally, it was created as a kit in France, and it was put together. It was a very shallow draft, different from the other ships. And so they put it together, and then they numbered every timber with Roman numerals. And then they took it apart, and they were going to put it on well, maybe they didn't take it apart. They were going to put it on one of the other ships in pieces and then put it back together when they got to the New World so that they would have a shallow draft vessel to explore. But as they were loading everything, they realized they needed it for their stores. They needed to go ahead and sail it. So it was the smallest of the ships that sailed over. Then once the excavation began, we began to see those Roman numerals on the timbers. So it was really fascinating.
There's also a half-scale replica in Palacios of the bell.
Oh, thank you. Yes. They put together one that could sail. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And then I was just curious about the outline of the Presidio fort had 8 points, whether there was some significance to that 8-pointed design of the fort.
So the military aspects of it were really important, because when you had your points out like that, you could see and or shoot, okay, from those points along your walls at any point. And apparently, I'm not that much about the history of military facilities like that, but apparently that was just the latest in the technology as far as settling the new world. And this was, the latest way they were trying to do that.
Okay, interesting. What else?
Any other questions? As we can take a quick break.
Well, thank you, Pam. That was a great presentation. I really enjoyed that.
Oh,
Yes, thank you. That was awesome.
Thank you.
gives you a
So
good overview. Mhm.
we're going to take a short break.
Very short.
And,
Yeah.
So we can come
5
back
minutes.
at maybe about 5 minutes. And we're going to do an exercise that Pam has put together. And I don't know if everyone has had a chance to, we forwarded out some materials, whether you've had an opportunity to print those out, because I think it would be easier as Pam goes through the exercise, if you have those laid out in front of you to make notes on and to follow along with the exercise. So we're going to take a short break, come back in about 5 minutes. Let's come back at 11:20 and we'll get started on the exercise.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
You have to pin yourself in when you go to this exercise.
We mute.